Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. Welcome back to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm Michael Sirmon. Over the last several episodes, we've been talking about clarity, identity, boundaries, purpose, and potential. We've talked about saying no. We've talked about creating space. We've even talked about becoming the person God created us to be. Well, today I want to talk about something that's quietly holding a lot of people back. Not the talent, not the opportunity, not a lack of intelligence, something much more subtle. Waiting for permission. Think about it. How many times in your life have you waited for someone else to tell you it was okay? It was okay to rest, okay to change direction, okay to leave a job, okay to start a business. It was okay to set a boundary, okay to heal from something painful. It was okay to pursue a dream. It was okay to become the person you feel called to be. You know, many of us spend years waiting for a permission slip that never arrives. And the reason it never arrives is because it was never theirs to give. When we're children, permission makes sense, right? We have to ask our parents. We have to ask our teachers. We have to ask authority figures. Things like, may I go outside? May I stay up later? May I try this? May I do that? Permission's just part of growing up. But something interesting happens as we become adults. Many of us never stop asking. We simply change who we're asking. Now we're asking coworkers. We're asking friends, family members, people on social media. We're asking our critics. We're asking the crowd. We're still looking around hoping someone will tell us it's okay to live our lives. What's even more interesting is that sometimes the people we're seeking permission from aren't even present anymore. We're waiting for permission from a former boss, from a parent who may have passed on, a former coach, a teacher that we once loved. We're looking for permission from somebody who criticized us many years ago, someone who made us doubt ourselves, someone who planted a seed of fear inside of us. Their voice may no longer be in the room, but is still living rent-free in our minds. And before every major decision, we find ourselves asking a question. What would they think? I've seen this happen with leaders. I've seen it happen with pastors. I've seen it happen with husbands, with wives, with people in every walk of life. With leaders, a leader knows change needs to happen. They know a difficult conversation is necessary. They know a boundary has to be established, but they hesitate. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they're waiting for approval. They're waiting for certainty. They're waiting for someone to validate what they already know. And while they wait, opportunity passes. The problems grow, stress accumulates, and momentum disappears. But here's what I've learned over the years. Most people think they're waiting for confidence, but confidence is rarely what they're waiting for. They're waiting for permission. They tell themselves, once I'm more confident, I'll do it. Once I know more, I'll start. Once I feel ready, I'll move forward. But you know what? Readiness, it's always a moving target. There's always another book, always another course, always another certification, always another reason to postpone the action. And the truth is that many of life's most important decisions happen long before confidence arrives. You don't feel ready to become a parent. You don't feel ready to lead a team. You don't feel ready to start something new. When I first started in ministry, we were attending a church, and my wife's uncle, James, was the pastor of the church. And one day he came up to me and he said, well, are you ready to start teaching? And I said, well, I feel like I've been a sponge, so yes, I'm ready. And he took me and he put me as the teacher over we called it the blue hair group. It was the senior ladies group in the church. I mean, these were women who had been in church learning, some of them 3 times longer than I had been alive. And I thought I was going to step up and teach them. But you know what? I learned more from them and more about teaching by stepping in front of them and just beginning to step out and begin to teach from my fear, teach from my uncertainty, right? Teach from a vulnerable position, because that then allowed them to take the wisdom that they've been looking for permission to pour into somebody and pour that into my life. Often in life, we don't feel ready to forgive, but that's when it's most important that we tell ourselves we have to forgive, because we're not releasing them, we're releasing us, right? We don't feel ready to step into our purpose, but yet we move forward anyway. And as we move forward, that confidence begins to grow. The opportunities begin to open up. But it doesn't happen before we take that first step, before we make that decision to move forward. The Bible actually gives us a lot of examples about people who didn't feel ready. I mean, think about Moses. God called Moses to lead. He's wandering around out in the wilderness where he had fled after killing the Egyptian. And he's taken a job, tending his father-in-law's sheep. And he's out in the wilderness. And then off in the distance, he sees a bush that is burning. Now, burning bushes were pretty common because there's a spontaneous combustion that happens out in the desert with a lot of these oil-laden bushes. The difference was this bush wasn't consuming. So when he stepped up and God began to speak to him from the bush, he immediately started explaining to God why he was the wrong person. God said, I want you to go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses, his first response was, I'm not eloquent enough, right? I'm not qualified enough. I'm not capable enough. Does that sound familiar? Think about the opportunities that you've been given. Is your first response to question the one who's asking you? Is it to explain why you're not the person, right? How often do we make those arguments about ourselves? One of my favorite characters in the Bible is actually Gideon. In fact, I wrote a song that's produced by Echoes of Sunday called From the Barn to the Battle, and it's about the life of Gideon and our approach to life from that same perspective. Gideon is hiding behind the barn, and he is threshing the grain behind the barn because the Midianites would sweep through like locusts and they would steal everything. So he's hiding and stealing it, or hiding it to keep it from being stolen, right? And the angel appears to him and says, "Hail, mighty warrior." Now, Gideon was not presenting himself as a mighty warrior. In fact, he's questioning everything about his life, questioning everything about what was happening in Israel at the time. But God, when he looked at him, he saw something that Gideon didn't see about himself. He didn't see the call God had on his life. He didn't see the fact that once he took that step, that God would partner with him and would begin to expand based off of expand his capabilities, expand his influence, expand his borders based off of his faith of taking that step. Not fearless. Matter of fact, often the steps we have to take are fearful steps, but it's taking that step into something that is bigger than ourselves. Because in my world, in my belief, in my faith, says that God always operates out of his abundance through us and not out of my weakness and out of my lack. So with Gideon, God saw something in Gideon that Gideon couldn't yet see in himself. Esther didn't feel prepared. Peter wasn't perfect. In fact, most of the people God called throughout Scripture didn't begin their walk with confidence, but they did begin it with obedience. They took the first step in their state of fear. They took their next step even though they didn't feel fully ready. And I think maybe that's the lesson that God wants to teach us, or He's had to teach me over and over and over again, right? Is that he never or rarely hands us certainty, but he does offer us trust. He doesn't usually provide a complete roadmap, but he does provide enough light for that next step. And sometimes that's where the faith begins. I've always laughed and said that if God ever showed me the full map, I would try to figure out a shortcut to get to it. So he could only show me one step at a time. Because the goal or the treasure is actually in the journey. If you think about the children of Israel, when they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years because of disobedience to God, that actually strengthened them and that actually prepared them for the first enemies that they were going to face. And it got rid of the doubters and a lot of other stuff. But the journey that we are on and the journey or the path ahead of us, the path is in place to prepare us for that first waypoint. We might call it a destination, but it's really a waypoint because the destination is the journey. And I think one of the greatest traps that in life is when we begin to believe that someone else either knows our path or knows our calling better than we do. Because when we get there, we begin to outsource the decisions that belong to us. We let other people then determine our priorities. We let culture define our success. We let expectations dictate our schedule, and we let fear shape our future. And before long, we're living a life designed by consensus instead of conviction. So a few years ago, I realized something was very uncomfortable. There were areas of my life when I was still seeking approval, not consciously and not intentionally, but I find myself wondering how certain decisions would be received. Would people understand? Would they agree? Would they approve? And then it hit me. There are moments in life where leadership requires disappointing people, not because you're wrong, but because your assignment wasn't given to them, it was given to you. Now, that doesn't mean we ignore wise counsel. In fact, wise counsel is very important. Mentors matter, trusted friends matter, prayer matters, seeking advice matters. But there's a difference between gathering wisdom and surrendering responsibility, because at some point, the decision belongs to you. At some point, the decision belongs to me. So maybe you've been waiting for permission to rest. Maybe you've been carrying a responsibility that was never yours. Maybe you've been exhausting yourself trying to meet everyone's expectations. Perhaps today is the day you give yourself permission to breathe, because it's possible you've been waiting for permission to pursue a dream. You've had an idea for years, a calling, a business, a ministry, a creative project, and you spent years wondering if it's realistic. Maybe the question isn't whether it's realistic. Maybe the question is whether you're willing to begin. Maybe you've been waiting for permission to heal, to release bitterness, to let go of a painful chapter, to stop carrying a wound that has defined you for too long. Well, you know what? Healing doesn't require unanimous approval. Sometimes it requires a decision. Mm-hmm. Maybe you've been waiting for permission to become who God created you to be. Not one who everyone expects you to be, and not who you used to be, not who fear tells you to be, but who God designed you to become. So here's your challenge for this week. Take out a piece of paper and write at the top, permission granted. Then finish the sentence. I give myself permission to, maybe it's rest, maybe it's change, maybe it's healing or courage, or maybe it's beginning, or maybe it's letting go. But whatever it is, write it down. And then take one small step toward it this week. Not next month, not next week, or next year, but this week. Because the life you've been waiting to live may not be waiting on more confidence. It may not be waiting on better circumstances. It may not even be waiting on more clarity. It may simply be waiting on the permission you've been refusing yourself to give. Think about that. And thank you for joining me for another episode of Lead Well, Live Whole. If this episode resonated with you, I'd appreciate it if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. And be sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps more people discover these conversations and become part of our growing community. And remember, you were never created merely to survive the pressure around you. You were created to lead well, live whole, and walk confidently in the life God has entrusted to you. So until next time, take care and God bless.